You might remember this guy.
You can now own Endgame on a PC starting at $59 a month with NZXT's new subscription flag.
And this subsequent apology that had dozens of cuts per paragraph.
I want to acknowledge also that there are ad campaigns out there done that were not factual, didn't represent the actual program, calling out ownership when it really is a rental program.
And today it looks like there's some justice to the tunes of millions of dollars in a preliminary settlement offering that NZXT has come to with plaintiffs' attorneys who filed a class action complaint looking to become a class action lawsuit against NZXT for its rental computer program, which is where these clips come from. We published those in our 2024 investigation into what we called a predatory evil scam, wherein NZXT and Fragile, a partner, were renting out computers to people who couldn't afford an outright purchase. But among many other shady things, like advertising the program to children on the basis of maybe you'll win a Fortnite tournament and be able to pay for the whole thing.
And if you think about it, Carter PCs did make a video about it. You could literally get one of these PCs for 1 month and then win a Fortnite tournament or something and have enough money to buy your own PC.
NZXT also had issues with things like the specs of the computer changing. When you switched from buying to renting, they would silently swap out the parts to be worse. Additionally, this is just generally the pioneering of you'll own nothing and be happy in the home computing space, which we just vehemently disagree with. So this is a rare instance today of what looks like might become some justice in the consumer electronics world. Public court filings for a class action filed after our investigative report, citing our report as evidence and making civil RICO, or racketeer influenced and corrupt organizations claims, show that NZXT and attorneys for a class action lawsuit have reached a preliminary settlement that would forgive the debt up to $5,000 of those in debt collections for those who rented computers from NZXT and partner Fragile. In other instances, users who rented the computers for 2 years will now be able to own those computers and stop making payments on them. And finally, users who rented and returned the computers will be entitled to cash if this preliminary settlement is approved by the judge. The claims in the class action filing were major, with our own attorney analyst of legal claims saying this.
The fact that it has a private right of action is very interesting because it again evokes the emphasis on money. Is that it is, RICO seems to be focused a great deal on attacking the funding of criminal operations or just unscrupulous civil operations. But the idea that you're engaging in improper business practices means that the money should be something that people can go after more directly.
So this $3.45 million preliminary settlement is in relation to the NZXT and Fragile rental computer, as we called it, scam. We still maintain it's a scam. It is, I mean, they're still doing it. So this isn't a clean victory. But having debt forgiveness for people who fell for this rental computer program scam thinking they'd be getting something else, whether that's different components or whether they thought it was rent to own because of some of the language and the marketing and the advertising, having debt forgiveness right now, especially when it is some of the worst economic times that we've seen in over a decade. A lot of people are really struggling right now financially, and having that in the settlement, I think, is awesome for the people who might be just in a bad position, and this has contributed to that. Our understanding is that the debt collectors related to this program have been pretty aggressive. And given that the NZXT Fragile rental program costs seemed mathematically worse than taking a predatory, possibly criminally backed loan to buy the computer outright by our previous research where we did some digging, it makes sense that this debt would be valuable to collectors and that people, customers, would feel tricked into the program. But the saga is hopefully coming to an end. So let's go over some of the details. We brought you this video with store.gamersnexus.net and the temporary 10% discount code, PUCKGamersNexus. That's P-U-C-K Gamers Nexus as one word. You can use code PUCKGamersNexus right now on the store to tell us to go puck ourselves. Just like NZXT probably wants to tell us right about now. You can use the code to grab our brand new wireframe V2 mouse mat on the store. Also, accompanied by our new Micro Slop t-shirt that's on its way to our warehouse right now. These feature a parody Micro Slop logo with a blue screen of death frowny face, warning marks from a vent viewer, and our rendition of Tux the Penguin hidden away, and of course, Micro Slop. So everyone you pass either thinks you work there for now, or they know your thoughts on AI. The wireframe V2 mouse mat on the GN store was made by Andrew on the team in Blender, fully 3D modeled, and then represented in a high-quality mouse mat that you see here. The mat can easily accommodate a keyboard and mouse, has fine detail with the city built of wireframe components for the heatsink, RAM, because let's be honest, it's the only place any of us can get any now, and cooling tubes, and we use a matching blue stitching for anti-fray with a blue rubber underside for some unique GN flair. We modeled these to ridiculous levels of depth in that there are things in the model that you can't even see in the product because we went that deep with it. Like, for example, the springs underneath the switch, underneath the keycap that's represented in the matte surface. Head to store.gamersnexus.net to support our deep dive, independent research content like this directly. We'll start with the big news, which is the preliminary settlement. The preliminary here is because the two parties, so NZXT and Fragile, which are the defendants, and the plaintiffs' attorneys, which are the class action attorneys in relation to the rental computer program pursuing some form of damages, RICO civil claims, things like that. These two groups have come to an agreement. They've agreed. Now it's subject to judge approval. The judge in these cases, as we understand it, basically looks to make sure that the settlement is fair for not only the plaintiffs and the defendants, but also for the people who would be receiving that settlement. So it's pending approval there, but as far as NZXT, Fragile, and all the attorneys are concerned, they've come to an agreement. So that's the big news. We're gonna go over that. And then if you're out of the loop on this stuff, it is in relation to coverage we ran in 2024. We'll have a kind of quick recap for you after we get through the basics. But here are the key facts for what this settlement is. The court value of the settlement is $3.45 million. Of that, $923,117.92, specific there, will be debt forgiveness for people being chased by debt collectors for the rental computers. An additional $1,216,129.02 of relief will be granted in the form of transferring ownership of rental computers to their customers. NZXT Flex rental computer customers who have, 1, paid for at least 2 years, and 2, who fill in a form stating that they believed they would come to own the computer after a period of rentership, will now own that computer. So if you have one of these NZXT Flex rental computers right now, and you've had it for, I think it's 2 years or more at this point, then if you believed that you would come to own the computer at the end of the term, which you probably did because that's what NZXT's advertising and advertising partners certainly seemed to suggest, as we said in our reporting previously, then you should fill in that form and you would come to possession of the computer. Flex rental customers who currently owe a debt for their rental computers will have that debt forgiven, up to a total of $5,000 of debt forgiveness per customer. If a customer is delinquent on rental fees, that delinquency, again, will be forgiven up to this amount. NZXT Flex rental customers who have returned their computers and who do not have any debt are still entitled to a cash payout. The total payout will depend on how many people file a valid claim, but for example, if say 10% of valid customers file, which as we understand it would be a relatively high percentage for class actions, then each person would get around maybe $450 to $500 plus or minus a bit. But again, to be clear, that's gonna depend on how many people file a valid claim. So if 100% of affected people claim, then each person gets less money in total in the situations where they were a customer who rented it, returned the computer, and owe no debt. It doesn't affect the amount of money for debt forgiveness, and it doesn't affect the amount of rental computer ownership sort of transfers. That is coming from a separate pool of money in this total settlement. There's a common misconception with class actions that unclaimed money from these types of agreements just all goes to the lawyers. That's not true. Actually, it's going to be distributed evenly based on the amount of claims that they have. And then the amount of money for the lawyers, that's determined separately by a judge as normally a percentage. So anyway, for people who've been getting chased by debt collectors, $923,000, well, $923,117.92 of the total $3.45 million settlement will be forgiveness for those debts, and $1.216 million will be for the computers in the form of being able to keep them. So that's all the basics. There are dozens of pages to these documents. We've been reading through all of them. It's kind of like a 14-page summary we read through, and that's the end result of it. So it looks like some justice for this. Couple important points though. First of all, NZXT and Fragile still have rental programs, and they've rebranded them as part of this lawsuit. And so part of that rebranding means that NZXT has now changed the naming such that it is not as, in my opinion, misleading as previously, where now instead of when you switch from purchase to rental, it doesn't keep the name and silently change the specs because fuck you, I guess. What it does instead is changes the name. At GN, our belief is that these rental computer programs, especially as they're structured, especially with the costs associated, they are, I think, just the absolute worst value you could get for getting a computer. There are better ways to get computers. We talked about them in our original piece. That hasn't changed. So the money side, the cost as a consumer, that hasn't changed. It's all the same in terms of the value that you get. You would be better off in a lot of situations buying a computer on a credit card or something, which we don't necessarily recommend either, but a lot of people do that. And financially, depending on your situation independently, it's a lot better than the rental program. So all that bullshit, that's still there. Renting a computer is still just abhorrent, I think. It's part of this you'll own nothing and be happy. And the big difference between renting something like a piece of property to live in, like an apartment, and renting a computer, both of which are basically necessary at this point. I mean, if you want to look for jobs, you probably need a computer. You can go to a library, I guess. But the point is, computers and the internet at this stage, they are, although maybe less important than shelter, they are up there with effectively utilities that you probably need to get anywhere in life. And so they're important. The difference between a rental apartment and a rental computer is that your apartment isn't going to become technologically obsolete in a couple of years when Microsoft decides, fuck you, Windows isn't going to work with that apartment anymore. Pretty big difference. Also, there are protections in place for renting an apartment in a lot of places. I mean, there's normally a cap on how much they can increase the rent. There's all kinds of stuff to protect people. With rental computers, those protections, they're not the same. They're not as robust. They're not as defined. And that's because this is a new area and it's being worked out as we speak. This is part of figuring out what the limits are to this, unfortunately, because all of this is just part of the, you'll rent everything that's in your life from your car to your house to your computer, apparently. But anyway, so the main points here, preliminary settlement means that this could change a little bit. They are going through that process. It's the judge who's kind of reading over things next and making a determination. I suspect this is a done deal, but if it changes, we'll let you all know in a hardware news update unless there's some major shakeup. Second point here, a settlement means it will not go to a trial by jury. Now, for a lot of reasons, you might typically want a trial if you think you have a really strong case because you can set a precedent. You might get a lot more money out of it too because the claims that they filed are pretty fucking bad for NZXT, like civil RICO charges and a whole bunch of other stuff talking about false advertising. They're marketing to kids, which has all kinds of different implications for it. And so it looked pretty bad for NZXT. Now, one thing here that's maybe unique is that the entire PC industry is in a massive downtrend right now. And we happen to have, for a separate content piece we're doing, some data that includes sales performance of different companies, and we've compared it, and everybody is hurting bad right now. Like it is, unless you're Samsung, Micron, SK Hynix, NVIDIA, or AMD, I guess, maybe Intel. But if you're like a case company or a pre-built company, or you make liquid coolers, all of these things NZXT is, you're probably in pretty bad shape right now. And one of the things that we've kind of heard through the industry is that NZXT right now in particular has absolutely fallen off a fucking cliff for sales. And a lot of that is related to the industry downturn in general due to DRAM shortages and AI component demand of consumer silicon that could have gone to consumers like memory. And so because of that, NZXT has now dropped from a first or top 2 seller position in some of these retailers with some of the categories they sell to not even in the top 4 or 5 anymore. And the end result of that is, if these shortages continue and if companies start going out of business, there's a real risk that NZXT could go under before a lawsuit would actually be settled by a jury. Like that's a really slow process. So I don't suspect the lawyers really had any insight to any of this when they were working on all this stuff, but that might be a reason that a settlement in this instance makes sense if you want to make sure you get something in the event they do go under. And I don't know if NZXT will go under or not. I'm just saying right now it looks really bad for a lot of the companies like them in the industry. Let's dig into more of the specifics of the agreement proposal and the summary. So in addition to the financial side that we already went over, the document also gets into some details on caveats, things like that. As for how many people are affected, we got some pretty interesting numbers. The document states that the settlement class, which would be anyone affected by NZXT and Fragile's program, consists of 19,322 people, both past and current subscribers during the period. The period is defined as October 19th, 2023 until March 30th, 2026. Any newer subscribers from the last 10 days or so wouldn't be eligible. Relating to debt forgiveness, the document states that those ineligible for debt forgiveness or whose debt is less than $500, and if they don't want to keep the computer, they can instead claim cash from the other pool of money. The document also states that debt forgiveness is given to class members, quote, more than 90 days delinquent on payments, end quotes. That's some of the eligibility. And there's some definitions and limits there. They also say that, quote, debt forgiveness shall be provided automatically, end quote, for those who don't opt out. In other words, as we understand it, you don't need to file a form to have eligible debt forgiven. It should just happen. Although we need to wait for all this to be final from the judge, and we aren't legal experts, but that's our plain text interpretation of this. Anything that doesn't get cashed or successfully deposited within 90 days of it being sent would be used, other than for whatever administrative fees that are associated with managing it, to be distributed pro rata to other members. The document specifically spells out that none of it goes back to Fragile or NZXT. We had a chance to speak with the plaintiffs' attorneys to get some additional information. So the plaintiffs' attorneys are CPM Law. They are class action attorneys. Might sound familiar to some of you who've watched the channel for a while because they previously represented us in a separate class action case. They are not active representatives of us right now, but we had a chance to talk to them again. They've actually been on the channel in the past, and they were saying that because there's good documentation for this program, they think it should be fairly easy to find the people who would be eligible to make claims. So sometimes the problems with class actions are maybe it's something that went on for 6-7 years or something. Like, I did not mean to choose those numbers. I swear to God, I didn't mean to choose those numbers. Let's say it went on for 7 or 8 years or something, and that actually was just, there's a common amount of time, all right? It wasn't supposed to be a meme. Fuck that meme. But if it went on for 7 or 8 years, and if you don't have email records for your customers, then it might be hard to track people down to say, hey, you are entitled to money from this class action. So in this case, what I think you should do is if you were a customer of this, one of the 20,000 or so people, you should in your inbox probably whitelist terms like NZXT and Fragile and Flex maybe, so that when they eventually start sending out emails about how you might need to sign up for certain payouts or things like that, you make sure you see it doesn't go to spam. So that's just my thoughts on that. But status of the settlement's pretty simple here. The final approval hearing is to be set sometime after September with no firm date yet. That's the point at which the judge will finalize everything. Our understanding is that CPM Law will create the settlement website and the phone number within 21 days of this document that we've been looking at going public. So that should be up within a couple weeks at this point. So let's just say we get down to September or whenever they approve this and say the judge approves it. At that stage, the people who are affected would have kind of 3 options. One is they could opt out of receiving anything from the settlement, and in that case, they would retain their right to then sue NZXT or Fragile separately. So that might be an option if someone thinks they have a separate case that they want to pursue. A second option would be remaining in the settlement, which in some cases doesn't require any action because it's automatic. In others, it does require action, like submitting documents to show you have a valid claim. And at that point, you'd file your claim on the website whenever it goes live and get money or relief from the settlement. And then if you do that, my understanding is that, like in most of these class actions, you would at that point release any claims on Fragile or NZXT, at least relating to this matter. I'm not sure if that extends beyond that, depending on the language they put at that time. So that would mean you lose your ability to individually sue them, at least relating to this situation, if that matters to you. And then the third and final option would be working with a lawyer to tell the judge that you object to the settlement and why, but you'd still remain in the settlement. So if the judge is like, nah, I don't agree with your reasoning, you're not giving up the ability to get that money. And then you would have the opportunity to object. So that's our understanding of it from speaking with some of the attorneys on how this stuff works. As for what got us here, we'll keep this pretty brief since we have 2 whole videos on this, one of them an hour long from 2024, but NZXT and Fragile are the partners here. Fragile facilitates these flex programs. They do this with other companies as well. We've seen it for rental headphones. One of the companies they work with, you can subscribe to your headphone. Literally, it is a subscription pair of headphones. So the two companies partnered together on a computer rental subscription that cleverly put aging inventory through circulation when it was sitting in the warehouse, sitting on shelves, and allows that inventory to go to work and make money for them. This is coming from the same company that dragged its feet for months when one of its products was a literal fire hazard and people had the NZXT H1 mini ITX case catching on fire because of a design flaw in the riser cable, which is something that we later went on to prove and raked them over the coals enough that they eventually did actually do something to make it right. Ooh, fire. Hey, get that. All right. There it is. The biggest problem with all this, the rental program, of course, is the fact that there's a subscription computer program at all, and the pricing is really, in a lot of cases, not any better than it was previously. They've changed some of the marketing language on the website, but this is still like, if you were to buy on credit in a lot of cases, at least you end up owning it at the end of it. And that was kind of the whole big point the first time we covered this stuff. So it's just, people getting ripped off indefinitely for a subscription computer, even if NZXT goes through and changes the marketing, makes it so that they're not making false statements, or makes it so that their advertising partners aren't falsely advertising it. Whatever the case may be, it's still, at the end of the day, a subscription computer program, and that is leading the charge for the you'll own nothing corporate rentership, feudal, the tech feudalism that we're in now, where they're just part of the problem with everyone else. But NZXT is still renting computers out. In the very least, we went through their website. The language is clearer in some spots that we checked now. They call it very plainly and right on the main page, a month-to-month subscription. And the builds now have firmer statements on the specs. So the lawsuit has changed the marketing language, but it hasn't changed the existence of the rental program itself. Of course, personally, I'd love to see no rental, no subscription computer program, period, just because the pricing's not good, and it's just inherently, I think, kind of predatory. I mean, it puts people in a position with, in particular, a piece of hardware equipment these days that you kind of nest in. You put your whole life in a computer. It makes it very difficult to relinquish it, and people who are less technically capable in particular will be more vulnerable there, where it's hard to rip everything out and move it somewhere else, and so you get kind of locked into rentership. And so I don't like these programs, period. I think renting a computer is not good for the future of owning stuff, in particular important electronics that you need to work and find jobs and make money and talk to your friends and all that stuff. It is functionally a utility, I think, at this point. But anyway, the program continues. They've just changed how they're marketing it. NZXT, it would appear, needs to somehow generate money and value after their $100 million Francisco Partners investment years ago. And it seems that this is going to be their way to do it. So the lawsuit was serious. And although it won't be tested in front of a jury, in this case, like I was talking about, NZXT, as we understand it, is not in good financial shape right now. I haven't seen the numbers, but we've had enough people in the industry tell us that, and especially their competitors who've noticed that suddenly they've dropped down in the rankings substantially, that maybe it makes sense to do a settlement instead in this particular instance. And we'll talk with attorney Vincent Augusta, who will join me to analyze some of the original lawsuit and the filing so that everyone can kind of get a better understanding of what the claims were, and we'll talk conclusions. I read through pretty much all of this except for the parts where they cite us, which is like half of it.
Several dozens of citations, I believe, to Gamers
think
Nexus.
if you control F Nexus, I think it comes up like 40 times.
Yeah.
So I read through most of it, and I mean, I guess maybe this is normal for this type of complaint, but it seems to me to be like relatively aggressive on the things they're going after, on describing, anti-consumer behavior, misrepresentation, and/or, this is my word, but and/or fraud, things like that. So RICO jumps out at me.
Absolutely, as it should. So RICO is the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. So it's a piece of legislation from the early 1970s designed pretty specifically to combat criminal syndicates operating at the time. So RICO is an attempt to create severe punishments specifically for racketeering, which is illicit acts or illegal acts that are done for commercial gain or profit, insofar as they're done with a group of individuals creating what's called an enterprise.
Okay.
And so the idea is when these individual persons or entities engage in a criminal enterprise and they repeatedly commit these criminal acts, there should be a punishment for them, specifically because they are part of this criminal enterprise.
Okay.
And so this was...
So this is a requirement, like not just this wouldn't be used on a single operator operating in isolation.
Yes, RICO by its very terms requires that there be a criminal enterprise separate from the illegal entities, and that there be at least 2 predicate acts to invoke the statute. And so this was more or less specifically designed to address the problem with criminal syndicates who were operating, by all appearances, legitimate businesses, and then were engaging in criminal activity behind the scenes in conjunction with others doing the same thing.
Okay.
And it was very difficult to prosecute individuals because of the perhaps the lack of severity for individual crime or the lack of connection to the other parts of the syndicate. And so RICO presents some very punishing consequences to being involved in this enterprise for a larger array of people participating. So if you have knowledge of the other criminal elements and you yourself are engaging in some of these racketeering activities, you can be held to be liable under RICO, both the criminal and the civil portions of it.
And then on the civil side, I think you were telling me that more recently they've added this private right of action.
Well, the private right of action has existed since RICO was made. There was a recent Supreme Court decision that talked about its application for personal injury.
Okay.
But for the purposes of this lawsuit, they're leveraging the wording of the statute itself, which allows for anyone who is harmed in their personal belongings or their business or their property by defendants who are engaging in racketeering to bring a civil action by themselves. They do not need to wait for the government to bring this action. They can seek to recover. And in doing so, the statute allows them to also seek treble damages, which is 3 times compensatory damages as punitives, costs, and very importantly, attorney's fees.
What are the attorneys, the plaintiffs, saying NZXT did sort of specifically that would warrant, a RICO claim?
So RICO identifies, I think it's 35 different illegal activities that constitute these predicate acts. They generally include some of the most heinous crimes you can think of, things like murder for hire, extortion, trafficking drugs, the sale of chemical and nuclear weapons. But there are also...
Is that why NZXT is...
That is not in the lawsuit.
Not the nukes.
Correct.
Okay, just to make it clear, this time it's not the nukes.
This time, yes.
Yes, okay, got it. No nukes at NZXT. The N does not stand for nukes.
No allegations as well that they may or may not
That's also good to know, okay.
The attorneys here, that they're seeking to recover under RICO for the more commercial white-collar elements. So things like mail fraud, things like wire fraud appear multiple times in the complaint.
What are those? Mail fraud and wire fraud?
So fraud is the intentional deception of another person or entity that you specifically intend to deceive and has the effect of deceiving. And mail fraud and wire fraud are just when you perpetrate that fraud using these communication devices. And we consider that to generally be more impactful because by using the mail and by using wires, you by default have a larger potential range of people you could harm. It's interstate, which is another problem because it evokes federal jurisdiction and it evokes a number of these consumer statutes that are cited in the complaint.
If I'm NZXT, then is my defense, well, I didn't mean to. I didn't know, right? Like, is that a viable defense if you're being accused of fraud? Is a reasonable response, well, I may have deceived them, but I didn't mean to deceive them.
It could be a defense, which is, I think, why this 84-page complaint spends a great deal of time speaking to that element of intent and that element of knowledge, and making the case that it is functionally impossible, going so far as to directly quote representatives of NZXT.
The CEO was quoted.
Correct.
Yeah, they had a quote about the advertising, which I remember covering back when that came out, where paraphrase something to the extent of the advertisements were inaccurate. And that also, I saw another claim in here that was, I want to say there was one for false advertising somewhere.
There is. I believe it's the California statute that prohibits false advertisement. And specifically, you'll see California statutes come up a lot in lawsuits like this, and this one specifically. But that particular statute provides protections against for consumers against being misrepresented through advertisements. The language of the statute speaks to making it unlawful for business to make, disseminate, or cause to be made or disseminated to the public, quote, any statement concerning personal property which is untrue or misleading, and which is known or which by the exercise of reasonable care should be known to be untrue or misleading.
Okay.
So by that language, and I'm not familiar with the way California courts interpret the statute, but that language to me seems like a much easier burden for a plaintiff to show, as opposed to the specific intent to defraud versus you should have known if you were exercising reasonable care.
Debt collection came up multiple times, FDCPA. So why is debt collection in here?
According to the allegations in the complaint, there were multiple debt collection processes that the plaintiffs are arguing violate various consumer protection statutes against unfair debt collections. North Carolina has one as well. There's a federal one, and California and a couple of other states have them. The idea is that when you are collecting a debt, even if the debt is legitimate, we want to restrict certain behaviors just in an effort to prevent abuse of that process. And so if you look at the allegations of the complaint, they're alleging that Fragile had attempted to collect on debts that had already been paid, that had done harassing outreach to individuals who had already explained to them that they didn't want to be communicated through those mediums, or who were trying to work something out, but were getting maybe multiple calls, multiple communications, and for those reasons, the plaintiffs are alleging they violated this particular statute.
Okay. There's a word that hasn't come up yet that you particularly like, and I don't want to rob you of the joy of being the one to say it. It's a D word. So what is the word and how is it used here?
So you will see in the prayer for relief that they have asked specifically, which is quite unusual, is for disgorgement and restitution of all earnings, profits, compensation, and benefits received by defendants as a result of their unlawful acts, omissions, and practices. So disgorgement is an unnecessarily visceral term. Used
it's like taking a needle to pop it.
Yeah, it is. The imagery is.
You're welcome.
Very, very evocative. But the idea is that there is a traditional remedy in law is going to be to make the plaintiff whole. So the plaintiff is harmed financially. We want to put the plaintiff back in the position that they were before the financial harm. Restitution or disgorgement kind of goes above and beyond that insofar as it is an attempt to take away from the defendant their ill-gotten gains.
So that's pretty much the recap of what the lawsuit was and what the settlement appears to be. The big takeaway here is, for me, just personally commenting on it as one of the sources for a lot of the material that was cited in the, in the claims and stuff. It's bittersweet. Where the thing I'm happy to see is the relief, and in particular the debt relief for the people who need it. That's great. It's good to see. Maybe it could have been more if they went through a lawsuit and went to trial, but a court ruling. But at the same time, if NZXT is in trouble financially, I haven't personally seen the numbers, but we're hearing this from a lot of companies in the industry, then maybe it makes sense to go the settlement route. But ultimately, the sweet part of the bittersweet is definitely on getting the help for people who need it. The bitter part is the fact that the program continues to exist. And I just personally, you all know in our audience at this point, what we think of how these companies are continuing to siphon away ownership and your ability to get access to hardware, your ability to own things. And on the data center side, it could be as simple as things like local LLMs are a threat to AI companies, and this is something they consider. Everywhere else, I mean, it's just as simple as charge you as much as humanly possible, as much as you can afford before you break. And then worst case, maybe you go rent a computer, because when the RAM prices are so high, $120 a month, that doesn't sound so bad anymore, except actually it's still pretty bad because it's indefinite. So yeah, that's, for me, bittersweet, but we wanted to bring you the news. I am ultimately happy that hopefully, if this all gets approved, the people who need it most will get the support. And then our continuing advice, of course, would be to not subscribe to hardware that you can actually own, especially not headphones. That was a weird one. That was Fragile, though. That's not NZXT. That's their some Fragile other partner. But that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. It's an interesting end to the saga. We'll see if we have more to talk about with it, though. And you can subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to support us directly. We could use your help for this type of report, or patreon.com/gamersnexus. If you like the kind of work we're doing and you feel like the consumer advocacy that we are pursuing on this channel and our other one are helpful for you. So thanks for your support. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you all next time.